Well, for my 6,000 subs, I thought I would do a few special things, and this is one of them where I do a special about Neptune and its origins somewhat. And in this, they're going to go somewhat into his origins, and I'll go a little farther. You notice this right here I use as my icon. I used to use one that was hand drawn, but he was throwing it. And it's real cool too. I almost felt like switching back and forth and doing things. I've got another one where this guy's got a Santa Claus hat on doing that and switching it during the holidays, a pumpkin head version and so on. But this is a real statue as versus the hand drawn one, and I've always liked it a little bit better. It's real, it's natural, and so on. So I want to get into Neptune or Poseidon and its origins and go through it somewhat and check out the depth of it and its connections. Neptune, the evolving Roman god of fresh water, the sea, and horses. Well, that's an odd combination, isn't it? Well, somewhat. The fresh water and salt water isn't a weird combination. For a lot of this comes from ancient Sumerian, like a lot of things does, or at least the beliefs that they had and connections that people from back then had, where rivers all meet the ocean. And that in some way, the fresh water mixing with the salt water had caused the thing that kicked off life. Somehow they believed in it. And Enki is attached to this, and he killed off the Absu, which is the abyss or the depth of the ocean, and one of those Leviathan killing off Yam, the sea beast type thing that goes through every one of these comparative things that you can look at. But in doing so, he ended up being the master of that ocean, and that was a significant thing also. Actually, people don't sometimes realize it, but Enki actually means Lord of the World. And so it's much farther than master of beast type concept. And he had this barge that they say it was a barge or a boat, but it was called Stag of the Absu. And he would go all the way from out in the Absu, so he was riding a stag or a barge type object, and go all the way up to the top of the river, way up through, and then to his home up in a cedar forest. It's pretty neat whenever you read all the little tales and things they have going on and get an insight to it. And after you roll through it a couple of times, you're like, ah. And if you study comparative stuff, it shows you a lot too. But he got relegated pretty much to not being that, and fresh water, if you will, and so on. But irrigation, that right there is extremely important. And in fact, the waters that come down. But then there becomes a switch in all these religions where a sky god, which is storms, and it comes in and causes the same thing. There's storms on the sea too. The ancient Romans believed that Neptune was the god of the sea. Although he is most commonly compared to the Greek god Poseidon, this had not always been exactly the case. Originally, Neptune was a god of fresh water and was only associated with Poseidon at a later date, whenever they put him together, and Poseidon was really a god of salt water in the ocean for these other people, and fresh water as a side note. So it's kind of like throw that together. Thanks to Neptune's connection with Poseidon, there are many Roman myths which the later is substituted with the former. So you can almost put them back and forth, and they had put him in there. And so whenever he had a lesser role in the Romans, necessarily, he had a bigger role in the people who had his name as Poseidon, and the Greeks and all the other people around the edge of the Mediterranean instead of down at that point. But of course, there was a whole lot more going on in the ocean, and the Phoenicians and so on at that time. So there was a place where, all the rivers meet the ocean. Yeah, so there is that thing that's always there, no matter where you go. Although many similarities can be drawn between Neptune and Poseidon, differences can also be seen. For instance, in ancient times, Neptune did not achieve the same kind of cult status enjoyed by his Greek counterpart In modern times, however, Neptune's legacy can felt more strongly than Poseidon's actually. So it kind of flipped back and forth, but that's the reason also, the society went towards Greek, and there's so many things that are named Greek. And in honor of the Roman society and cult that came out of that, and culture itself, we've named all the planets and so on like that along that line. But it's the same situation. And the Greeks called them the same planets. Well, it actually is the same as a lot of people did, and each one is the same, and Venus is always the same, and so on. And we'll get into planets that even couldn't be seen here in a minute. Because Neptune's supposedly not seen with the naked eye. Although I did a recent video where it talks in there and it tells you that you can see it at certain times, especially whenever it's effectively like the full moon effect to us, but hidden pretty much most of the other times, and you'd have to know where it is and all of these things. I think that's pretty indicative, though, of that Inky and that wonder and peekaboo type of guy that's supposed to have been associated with the trickster. How Neptune got his name and his early origins. Neptune's name is believed to be derived from the Indo-European word for moist. Yep, it goes back to there. And what? Well, actually Neptune too, both of them, but Neptune all the way from there, and that name and vocabulary is Proto-Indo-European for moist, wet, along that, but could be used in a name of like, well, it says it's the basis for the Latin word nebulo, his original name. And we think of nebula and clouds, and so its meaning goes with fog, mist, or clouds. In fact, nebula is what we call star forms that have blown up now and made the cool little thing, but it's saying that, well, they could see those back then at the time, and they were saying they were a blur, like a cloud, as opposed to being a spot. Now, astronomy was going on pretty good too, because you go out someplace, even in an open, to see if you can see one. There's a few that are visible slightly, and you get a decent telescope, and you're like, ah. But we've talked about that before. Neptune was originally a god of the ancient Italian type culture, or that region. At that time, he was worshipped as pretty much a minor god who was in charge of fresh water and irrigation, much like the Inky situation. And interestingly, the ancient Italians did not have a god of the sea. Well, they kind of did, but it was pretty much adopted from the Etruscans that lived right next to them. And most people know that there was a god of the sea that was Oceanus. That's a god of the ocean. So whether you're going to call it the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, or, how much you're going to go with this, the Neptune's known to have been a god of the Mediterranean, but he covers the whole thing. Because you see in the old things and all the old maps, the water went all the way around. So they had an idea it all connected, and it rained and became fresh water going down the thing, and then all turned into the sea and kept going around and around. Yeah, the salt seas, they mentioned bitter, if you will, in the Sumerians. So, kind of wrong. I think they correct it, though. Nevertheless, did they believe that there was a god who ruled over the enormous river believed to encompass the world? Well, that's the sea. His name was Oceanus, and it's also kept now. We call it the ocean, don't we? So, yeah. I mean, what was the sea named after? Somebody pointed at it and went, see? How does that work? Oceanus, who was viewed as the opposite kind of Neptune, it was another god. It was the Etruscan Neptune, who was once thought to have had made huge contributions towards the Italians' development of Neptune and many of their gods, which also correspond with Greek forms, but it's because of the earlier form that came before it. Neptune was believed to have jurisdiction over wells and well water, and his power was extended later on to have bodies of water, And of course, they connect with that. Whenever the body water rose, the well rises, so it's all connected. But in more recent times, however, scholars are of the opinion that the worship of Neptune preceded that of Neptune even. Well, of course, they don't want to go with anything Etruscan, so those just got to be shipped off to the side. We did a couple of videos about that. Therefore, it is thought that Neptune's development owed a great deal to Neptune rather than the other way around. And one could say that with the grain thing attached to it in the way that you go, but that's probably goes the other way, and they attached it to their god of grain because they used to live off a water system that flooded, and it had to do with irrigation and so on. Kind of makes sense. I've only seen a couple people go there with it rather than go, oh no, and try to make the nothing out of it. So, looking at this picture here, you can see the edge of it is all curled with, well, I don't know, you got top left-hand corner, you can see that it's all curled in water and waves. And then there's swastikas that are connected all the way around it here on the edge. And so there are gods here, and each one of them seems to have a beast pretty much next to it, and a center plate, center portion of it right here, and there's Neptune there, and the Trident, and he's got the 4 horsemen with him, and a couple of his offspring, which we'll talk about here a little bit. But other things with him, a lot of people say, well, here he is collecting shells maybe, and the dog, and this was whenever the gods and Kronos, whenever he took and he bit the thing and that gave him purple, and there's the girl with the purple on it, and so on, and it goes around. But also a lot of people have said, isn't this zodiacal? Yeah. But this is late 2nd century AD Roman mosaic entitled The Triumph of Neptune. Well, how did they get to the triumph part of it whenever he was not so well known? Well, kind of we'll get to that too, and I hope this doesn't run into 2 times. If it does, it's in the top left-hand corner. But how Neptune went from a water god to a sea god? Well, rivers meet the ocean. If you just keep going down, it's Neptune initially had nothing to do with the sea, they say. As a matter of fact, when Romans defeated their enemies at sea, they attributed their victory to Fortuna rather than a sea god like Poseidon. That is true, definitely. That was good fortune and so on like that, so they did that. But they noticed that in some of the earlier ones, and then later it became, and then all of a sudden they were attributing exactly the same Poseidon thing to it. But of course, they also became a sea power, didn't they? We know, however, that Neptune was officially connected with the Greek Poseidon as early as 399 BC. In that year, an interpretation of the Sibylline books ordered a lecticinium of ceremonial meal in order to win the favor of the gods. And Neptune was one of the deities invited, so there he is, majorly too. And the other gods honored with this ceremonial meal were Apollo, Latona, Hercules, Diana, and Mercury. Well, we know that Mercury is Hermes, and Diana is hooked up to Artemis and Asherah, Inanna, the huntress, goddess of love that flips. So a lot of people have known that all of these pretty much connect each other, and there is little flips about it. Hell, in 7th grade I learned, well, it was a little different than that, but we had to learn that Hermes is Mercury and the messenger and Diana and all that stuff. And let's go on. Based on this event, it may be said that Neptune was one of the earliest Roman deities to have been identified with a Greek deity. Since Poseidon was a major god in the Greek pantheon, Neptune's association with him boosted his cult status immensely. Thus, Neptune was transformed from a major god, or a minor god, in charge of fresh waters to a major god who even ruled the seas. It is not known exactly what myths Neptune featured in before his association with Poseidon, if any. Once the link between the 2 gods was made, however, Neptune could be conveniently substituted for Poseidon in the existing myths, like just say it. For instance, there's a well-known Greek myth of the Titanomachy, in which Zeus and his siblings seize power, the overthrowing of their father Kronos and the Titans. Everybody knows this, and in Clash of the Titans and the way in the Roman version of the myth, Zeus is replaced by Jupiter, Kronos by Saturn, and Poseidon by Neptune. People are probably real aware of this. Therefore, Neptune was now the brother of Jupiter and one of the most powerful gods in the Roman pantheon, as opposed to his position before. So he changed position from what they originally had him at, because that's the way that by the time they conflagrated their pantheon, he fit. And he hooked up with a god of grain, much like you could find that with Ninurta. Right. If you study Ninurta versus Saturn and versus this, and you'd be like, well, wow, he has that, and he's got lightning bolts. Well, they lend him the lightning bolts and all that. Well, that's in these stories too, and so on. But Neptune could make earthquakes and lightning bolts and things too, at least on the ocean and on the waters. He had powers everywhere there, yeah. And you watch even the kid movies where they made the recent ones about it, and he could run up into fresh water, anywhere there's water, really, right? And control it. So on. He could calm the seas and all those things. Some of them you hear of Jesus doing and so on. And that's why Jesus took on the persona of being able to do a lot of those things, to actually show it, and healing and all of these types of things. So he takes over Asclepius and so on. That's for other videos. Following the defeat of Saturn, Jupiter divided the world between himself and Neptune and Pluto, but that's Hades to the Greeks, and so he's to the underworld. So it's really between them, and then there's this other situation, the afterlife, which if you think about it lasts a whole lot longer than the life. So this is a real prestigious spot, not looked at like a devil situation like we all try to do today. It's Elysian fields and the whole situation, many of these people. So pardon me. Whilst Jupiter became the god of the sky and Hades ruler of the underworld, the seas became Neptune's domain. As the god of the sea, Neptune is usually portrayed with a trident, his weapon and a symbol of power. This is an apt object as it's a three-pronged spear used by fishermen. You could call it a harpoon, but they make smaller ones too that are like frog gigs and things like that. My dad told me stories when I was a kid, and I was like, that's the Neptune thing. He goes, oh yeah, yeah. In addition, the god is often depicted with fish, and sometimes with other sea creatures as well. So if they're out in the ocean, what the hell's that got to do with horses whenever he's the god of horses? Ah, now this comes from the Wayback Machine and these people that had horses. Yeah, it doesn't come out of nowhere. He's not associated with donkeys and our oxen, and then it becomes horses, like in Sumerian places that didn't have horses then did. And he's one of these old gods. They'll clarify that. So how does that work? Where do horses fit into this? Well, we'll get there a little bit here. So here's one of the different depictions of him with his wife. Now his wife is known as Salacia, and a lot of people have said that has to do with salt, right? Solace and salt and saline and all these things. Therefore, she was the salt water, he was the fresh water, and the mixing of the two of those. Now that's in an ancient myth where salt water and fresh water mixed together and things, and it's oddly like the earliest of Sumerian myths somewhat, and some other people's myths too, but they're all over here on the other side of the Black Sea, and some strange stories that apparently go with rivers and then into a Black Sea, as opposed, which is connected to the Black Sea by the Bosphorus, a Mediterranean, which actually means Middle Earth. You always got to figure that in. Now you look at statues like this, and these are mermaids holding him up. But actually, those are the masons that built everything, and they're shoving that heavy statue up onto there. Shows him here and his kids and so on. We'll get into that a little bit. He's directing something going on in the ocean. That's near Vienna, Australia, Hofburg Palace. For the Romans, Neptune's official wife was an obscure goddess called Salacia, who is speculated to have been an ancient Italian deity of salt water. This goddess has been identified with Greek Amphitrite, the eldest of 30 Nereids. According to one version of the myth about Amphitrite's marriage to Poseidon, the god of the sea desired to marry the Nereid. Amphitrite, however, preferred to keep her virginity and therefore fled to Atlas, which is on the other side of the Mediterranean, and the Atlas Mountains named for him, but it also is cognate to Atlantis. And Atlantis was supposed to have been ruled by Neptune or Poseidon in ancient days. Poseidon sent his subjects to seek Amphitrite, including a dolphin, which we talked about recently too, called Delphine, and he's in the skies. There's a dolphin in the heavens. The sea creature eventually found Amphitrite, persuaded her to marry Poseidon, and took charge of the wedding. What? Oh yeah, yeah. Read it. That's the way it goes. I could go off for a while here, but hey, so now we have this thing where Europa is actually a Phoenician goddess that married into this thing, and here's this thing, and she's the deal from over there, like Carthage, and maybe beyond a little bit in the Atlas Mountain area where Berbers are today. And what the yeah. For his contributions, Delphine was later placed in the sky as a constellation, as I said. Like his brother Jupiter, however, the god of the sea was also involved in many extramarital affairs, which resulted in numerous offspring. Check it. In Greek mythology, the heroes Theseus, who is supposed to be Proto-Indo-European in nature, Bellerophon, which is hooked up to horses, and Orion the hunter are all said to be the sons of Poseidon. It would be reasonable to expect that Romans also regarded Neptune as the father of these heroes. Incidentally, Pegasus, Bellerophon's winged horse, was also an offspring of Poseidon or Neptune in some tales, and in some tales he was actually just spawned out of Medusa's head whenever the blood fell, other than scorpions and stuff. You read that part of it too. And the conflagration of those multiple stories like that also shows you where they put things together in different mythologies and different stories into it and still kept the same thing. And a lot of people say that's how you can prove that it's a zodiacal thing, is because they tried to fit it into the same mold. Let's continue. In most accounts, Neptune and Salacia had 3 children: the god Triton, Rhodos, and Bethlem. Sick me. Don't try to get me to do it again. The merman Triton is arguably the most famous of Neptune and Salacia's 3 children, and Bentha is really not. Bentha is actually a word that means lowest, like benthic, and later on, and even in Latin and so on. And so there's this thing within Triton, of course, is there. And he's the merman. Triton is arguably the most famous of those children, and there are various myths about him. One of these myths, which relates to Jason and the Argonauts, which we talked about recently, and how that goes with the whole constellation deal. Triton is depicted as a god residing in Lake Tritonus. This is a large body of fresh water in North Africa mentioned in classical mythology, though its exact location is unclear because there aren't any more. In any event, Jason and the Argonauts get lost in the middle of a desert, and it was Triton who helped them find their way back from the lake to the sea. Well, I've talked about Atlantis and a few things before, but also in North Africa and the Green Sahara, and back when the Sahara was green just more than 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, how that relates to the erosion they talk about in the Sphinx and things. But also there was a video I did, Mermaids of the Green Sahara, and it talked about the people who live there, and there's cave paintings from there. It actually shows it in one of the movies, The English Patient. And anyhow, all this cave art hooked up with these ancient people that were they're across there, and at one time there were rivers running through there and a larger body of water, and it even ran out into the sea there between Tunisia, nowhere down near Carthage. It was more towards here. But then also there's the Eye of the Sahara, and everybody said, well, if it flows over and it's here, then that would be connected to it, and it would flow out from that into the sea from the other direction. Anyhow, so here we have in North Africa connected, and Jason and the Argonauts. And if you read the whole story about it, then when they talk about Ethiopians, they're not talking about the people that live in Ethiopia today. Ethiopia used to be called Abyssinia just recently. Then again, that's named after the abyss. And here we are back to Inki's type of thing. And that might explain why there's Kush Mountains over there, and the Zagros and so on, and then Hindu Kush, and then way over here there are people called Kushites, and we've made connections to that much later. Yeah, but that's for another video. Let's continue. Because here we can see a wall statue with an edifice built into it. And what is this? Well, this is actually the god Triton as a fish-like centaur blowing a bugle. Yeah, usually his back half is more fish-like, but here he's like a fish centaur. Now here we hook up with the horse situation again in centaurs, and we talked about that in horsemen, and where that concept shows and gets pushed through mythology with. But Triton was the ancient Roman god messenger of the deep. He was the son of Neptune and Cilicia. So he's the son, he's the god of the deep, or the god of the afterlife area, if you will, or the abyss, the deep. Triton appears quite common in ancient art, in which he is depicted with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a fish. Like his father Neptune, Triton also wields a trident, although there he wasn't. The god's most recognizable attribute, however, is a conch shell where he's blowing it. This is much like the people that you see out on the Canary Islands off of Africa, where they're blowing a horn and doing a trident type thing with the conch. In fact, a Triton is a type of shell too. Some of these things were kept in names for all time, but here we go again. The god's most recognizable attribute is a conch shell, which uses a trumpet, but in some versions of the myth, to the conch shell, the trumpet has been a power in calm or raise the waves, so he can make a storm happen, or he can calm it back down. And again, this is like a Jesus type thing, where that happened exactly in the first part of his deal. But that's not for this video, but a mention. One popular Athenian black figure vase, that black and red where they have, painting depicts Triton wrestling Hercules. I won't go into that. I'll make this thing a multi-parter real quick if I don't. Where am I at? 28. Neptune's rule over freshwater stayed, and horses were added. Although Neptune became the Roman god of the sea, his roots as a god responsible for fresh water was not entirely forgotten. Each year the Romans celebrated a civic festival in honor of Neptune called Neptunalia. Yeah, like the Christmas festival, and the 12 days of Christmas was to make up for a lunar calendar, and it runs over, and it was, of course, 12 is sacred and everything too, but that is a Christmas festival, and the 12 days of Christmas, and it goes with it Saturnalia. I did a video about it. Might do another one this year right around Christmas. Though we are told that during the festival the Romans would use the branches of trees to build tents or huts, kind of like elf things or whatever, and it's assumed that the celebrants would feast and drink in these temporary structures, or party out like Scythians for some reason. Why is that connected with the horsey thing? Well, if you've been paying attention to my videos, it's very much connected to the horsey thing and these little tents or huts that they'd make, but then the elfin situation too, again, that they would portray all of a sudden at one part, like go back to their roots into this natural day situation, if you will. But I could do a whole video on Neptunalia, so let's go on. Like this Greek counterpart, Neptune was also the god of horses and believed to oversee the sport of horse racing. In this guide, the god was known as Neptune Equester, like equestrian. According to one myth, Neptune is credited with the invention of the chariot. Alongside Minerva are Athena to the Greeks. Of course, Athena and the Athens, and they want to get connected to it, but we definitely know that they weren't the people that created the chariot. But whenever they pulled off all this chariot racing and everything else, then later they pulled that off. But we know how that went. Proto-Europeans first started chariots and brought them into this area. So the god, after all, is said to travel over the seas in a chariot drawn by horses, sometimes represented with fishtails. Now, this is the same thing that the solar god did whenever he was at one time, like Saturn, was pulled by goats. And of course, goats are associated with him and so on, but there were no horses. Then all of a sudden, everybody's got horses, and the sun god gets pulled by a 4-horse chariot across the sky. Yeah, just like in Armageddon. And that's why that's used too, by the way. And 4-horse chariots and what goes with all these people, and it hooks all the way up through time to Romans and stuff. And anyhow, these horsemen are a little bit different. And whenever their newer form, secondary form of this same tale comes in, some of the places were already taken, and so to fit them in, they fit in certain places, but other ones had to be in certain places. And so there was slight manipulations made, and there's, if you look at it, like I talk about variations on a theme in some certain places, but Isis and they're all the same person, and Venus goes with it. It just lines up a lot more than you'd even think that you could give a chance of if you just told everybody this version. They even wrote it down and you waited 10 years and got back together. There'd be no way it'd be as close as that. Seriously. But he said to go over the seas like the god goes over the sky and so on. Now here's Minerva, and she be getting on my nerves. Yeah, some of the tales said that Poseidon and her had tits and tats back and forth. And what's this? Well, this is supposedly adding into mythology, where Minerva came from in the Etruscans, believe it or not, from a goddess named as Minerva. And now we have that thing that's going on. We've talked a lot about the Etruscan gods and Vatica and how that goes with the Vatican and so on. And oh, it's in Rome and everything. Yeah, well, the Etruscans, yeah, that goes right there. Check it out someday. But all works together. But here's Minerva. She'd be working on Minerva and that Trojanish type helmet. But then again, isn't she supposed to? Yeah. She's also got a little Medusa scary face on her chest piece that's right there. According to another myth, Neptune was not collaborating with Minerva, but actually in competition with her. In this myth, the two deities were in conflict, as both wanted the capital of Attica to be named after themselves. In order to resolve this dispute, it was decided that the city would be named after the god who bestowed the most useful gift upon the city. Whilst Minerva gave the city's inhabitant the olive tree, Neptune created the horse. In the end, Minerva's gift was deemed to be more valuable and useful of the two. That's strange. There are other tales too that you can see go along with the Trojan War and things like that, where here it goes again where they're competing with each other somewhat, and she wants to leave an olive tree, but Neptune decides to build a well. Now that's real important, but where they're at is on a precipice up on a hill, and he's supposed to build this deep old well, and the sea sucked in onto it, and it's bitter water, and it ain't no good, and they went with a tree. Yeah. There are some mythologies that go along with it and some folktale type of stuff. I won't really go into it, or really this will go into a multi-parter for sure. I'm sure this is going to go over one, but not be a full two. How about that? In another horse-related myth, Neptune transforms into a horse to rape his sister, Ceres, which is Demeter to the Greeks, Demeter. This was because, which is Dios Mater, and that means mother. That means heavenly mother. And there was this thing. So what is this? No. This is a conflagration when you pull things together too. Again, it shows up in a lot of little places if you know and you go deep enough. Let's continue. This was because the goddess had transformed herself into a horse or a mare in order to escape from Neptune's persistence but unwanted advances. As a consequence, Ceres gave birth to a daughter and a black mare. And in some circles, they say this is from, this shows you where they made an all black stallion. And it's not just that he was colored that, but a different type of horse. It was like a more thoroughbred and long running. And they make connections to this and the ones that would actually run messages and do things that it could run long and do things. There's a quarter horse, and the way that works, a quarter horse is faster than a thoroughbred. It really is, but on a short term. It's a quarter. He can only run about the quarter of the distance, but faster. That's kind of the way it works. But a horse can run the full out and get as much out of as can, so that's being able to run a whole furlong at least. And of course you'd want to hook things like this up to chariots, but the chariots are pulling horses, so there's different horses for different things. I don't want to go into it now. I could do a whole one on horses. I could do a series on horses and y'all know it. As the god of horses, Neptune has been compared with another ancient Italian deity, Consus, although he is thought to have been an agricultural god. Again, see. Consus was also associated with horses and had an underground altar at the first turn of the southeast end of the racetrack in the Circus Maximus. Now, this is the horse racing thing that raced around in furlongs and all that. Mules and horses were honored on this festival of days as they were crowned with garlands and given rest from their work. Chariot races, albeit with mules rather than horses, were presided over by the gods' human priests. Consus' fate was opposite that from Neptune, i.e. his status dropped from being a major to kind of a minor deity in later time, but we see it's also that same flip. Here's something that's beautiful. This is like a brooch type of thing, and what this is a cameo. Now, if you look around the rim of this, it's got gold, and of course it's shaped like that, and it's holding on to this, going around. But down here at the bottom two areas, let me go up just a little bit, you can see those little humped areas that are in it there, that come up just a little bit in that rim, and that's just to help to hold it more. I believe there's ones on the back too, and on the top, but not on the front, top, back. But regardless, so when you look at this, this is a cameo and very nicely done too. It's incredible workmanship when you figure out the thing is probably a little bigger than a silver dollar and squished out like an egg, you know, or oval. And you look at this, and the way these things are made is they're taking a piece of stone that's like geode, and it has two different color stripes running through it, and they harness just the piece where it's changing between and get that little sliver out of it long ways. So it's all there. And so deep might be gray like this, and up top it turns yellow and got the little smears and orange red. And so around the rim you can see that orange that's there, but it gets even darker to that red of the horses that you see in the thing right above his head, because that's Neptune in his nakedness. But let's see, yeah, you can see all of that. So look how intricate this is. I mean, it's incredible, but notice how what they did was they made the stump that he's standing on thicker, so it still retained the orange and has that woodenish type color. But see the kid sitting over there next to him on the ground that's the light bearer and got the flame holding up? See how he still has blonde hair from the little smear that's in it? Look across on the right-hand side of the bottom of the girl with the long hair that goes with that. It looks like she's Venus or some type of pose there. She too has this same blonde in her hair, just the last streak of it left. Kind of like the color that's right up top in the middle with the thing that he appears to be holding up, but that's where his trident is hooked into, and so you don't see the tips of it. But on the edges of it, it's real light tan and blonde colored, and then it gets reddish orange, and then a dark blood red that the horses you see there, and you're familiar with horses being of that color, but their legs are a little bit lighter and so on. But notice how they were able to do it to where the close horse is red and the back horse, even his legs underneath and so on, are that secondary color. It's incredible workmanship here, and you think about this is bas relief, where they cut all this out and they made the background look flat again in between all this crap. Yeah, so it's that technology. You can see it on a wall, and you can see how they might be able to do it, but then it's hard as hell making that whole wall flat. You're basically taking 3 inches off of a wall, except for what you leave sticking out, make a structure out of it. This is so minute, and it's picking out around it. But notice at the top there, also the lady that's laying there with her draped blouse and things in there that looks very much like a creation of Michelangelo painting and stuff. She's got blonde hair titched to the left of the little bit that's there in that lighter color, and so again on the left is that god, who's got a couple of things that you would probably recognize as cherubims. But I've done a separate video about that. I just thought I'd stop for a minute on that. They just want to show you something, and sometimes there's this art that needs to be appreciated for just a minute. And then the trouble that somebody would go through and to understand how they cut it in levels to do the 3 different colors and all the way it goes. Pretty kick-ass. We're about 41 minutes. I spent too much time on that. Oh, and that was at the Isthmian Games, and he's the god of horses there. But Neptune never reached Poseidon's level of prestige, they say. Despite being elevated to the status of major god in the Roman pantheon, Neptune never attained the level of prestige that his Greek counterpart enjoyed. Yeah, when the Greeks hooked up to the Mediterranean, he had a lot more power than that, and of course all the powers that run off of rivers. Italy being a little different, running a little different ways, would have less power of doing that, and more of a storm god and things like that, so it easily did that. For example, in Athens, Poseidon was the most important god after Athena. Yeah. Additionally, the cult of Poseidon existed throughout ancient Greece, everywhere, and it extended. The god's most important cult center was his sanctuary near Corinth, so all the way over there, where the Isthmian Games were held, kind of like the Olympic Games, so there was more than one. Other important cult centers dedicated to Poseidon were Helice, Achaia, Onchestus, and Boeotia. So they had cult centers all around the place. One of the ones they're not mentioning is one that's right over near Sidon and the areas that we know of, where there's Baalbek and the temples that are there, and other temples down through that area, not showing up on this list. The cult of Neptune, however, did not spread throughout the Roman world as such an extent. Nevertheless, there were 2 major temples in Rome dedicated to Neptune. One of these stood near the Campus Flaminius, the Roman racetrack at the southern end of the Campus Martius. This temple was built in 25 BC and contained the most famous sculpture of a marine group by the ancient Greek sculptor Scopas. And having a connection to that word, I used to study fish and everything. There's a tang, like the yellow tangs that you see, look like big silver dollars, solid yellow. Well, there's a Scopas tang that looks like that, but he's tan and he fades to a mocha dark color. Looks like you're looking down a well or a pit with a shadow on one side, and it's pretty cool looking. It's named Scopas. Has a connective that people say, oh, he goes all the way back, perhaps this guy. It is speculated that the location of this temple was influenced by Neptune's role as the god of horses. The other temple was in the Basilica of Neptune, or Basilica of Neptune itself, located on the Campus Martius. This temple was dedicated by Agrippa, Augustus's close friend and right-hand man, to Neptune in commemoration of the naval victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. This shows that by this time Neptune had replaced Fortuna as the god responsible for giving the Romans victory at sea. In fact, yeah, by this time it was over. We're going to part 2 in your top left-hand corner right now. So click on it whenever it comes up, and I'll see you there. Hey, click like on this, put the comment down. You can get to the next one in just a second. Pause it, and we'll see you there. Peace.